Today we're going to be talking through some best practices for how you can achieve a more data-driven approach to donor management. And my name is Lizzy. I'm an applied data scientist here at Civis. And so going over the agenda for this presentation, we'll be diving in a little bit to thinking about the financial impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Then we'll be going through 3 different areas where you can think about data-driven tools and best practices for your donor management. And those will be first-party data analytics, survey research, third-party data and modeling, and then how to get started on this data-driven approach. And so I'm sure everyone is well aware that the pandemic has had a very strong impact on the finances of individuals, of organizations like your own throughout the pandemic. And what we've been finding in our general population national surveys over the past few months is actually that levels of personal concern about household income have been decreasing. And so this makes sense, right? People are feeling a little bit more confident with vaccination levels, the pandemic coming under control. And this can then have implications for how we're trying to think about approaching donors. And so when we're looking at the survey research, something we always think is really important is thinking about the nuance. And for example, looking into subgroups. And so whenever we're thinking about the pandemic, of course, we know that there is a disparate racial impact across groups. There's a disparate impact across all different groups, of course. But in this case, when we're looking at our survey data, we really want to dive into thinking about how different groups might be impacted. So maybe we're looking at here on the left, we're looking at levels of personal concern about job security. And we're seeing that Hispanic and Asian respondents tend to have the highest levels, pretty closely followed by Black respondents, with a pretty large gap above white respondents. But then when we're looking more specifically at personal savings and levels of concern on that area, we're seeing actually that Asian and Black and Hispanic respondents do have, slightly different rank order in their levels of concern. And this can kind of impact the types of messaging to individuals, whether you're looking for donors, whether you're just kind of hoping to engage their interest. And so ultimately, nonprofit organizations like your own, just like people, have seen these different disparities impact them throughout the pandemic. And you're trying to adapt to a new sort of paradigm where you might not have the same tools available. There might be new areas you want to explore in terms of engagement and different financial realities. And so what we're hoping to show you here is that whether you're looking for new donors to engage with, if you're trying to create a strategy to re-engage with your donors in this new context, or if you're trying to reach to a new, different type of donor, ultimately, these data-driven tools are trying to help you learn how to understand who people are and then how you can talk to them. And those are kind of the 2 cornerstones of donor management. And so for this first area, and I'm going to walk through these 3, we're going to be talking about first-party data analytics. And so for each of these different kind of areas of data-driven donor management, we'll be thinking about what this is, how we recommend approaching this area of data, what the available resources are to you, and then some examples of how you might go about one of these projects. And so for first-party data, that's data that's already available to you. That's going to be the highest quality data because it's coming directly from your interactions with donors, whether that's through their gifts, through their subscriptions, to your emails or petitions, through their online engagement and behavior with your social media. And increasingly different platforms, whether it be Salesforce, Twitter, Facebook, they're giving you a lot of in-software tools that you can use for reporting and analysis. And that can really enable you to use your own data to come up with different insights. And so when you're thinking about these different ways to use first-party data, what you really want to do is start off with a well-scoped research question. And so I'm going to kind of walk through an example here. So there was a large disaster relief organization that came to Civis, and they had a theory that their disaster donors behaved differently from their blue sky donors, and they wanted to find out why. And that was their well-scoped research question they started with. And so another important tenet of this process was coming up with this shared understanding of the outcomes and the use of the insights they were trying to generate. They had a team where they wanted to make sure that we weren't just kind of coming up with an insight and not driving any new changes and new approaches with it. It's also important to have agreed upon definitions. So when we're thinking about this research question, we want to make sure we have an understanding of who these regular donors are, who these disaster donors are, what are the different categories we can then have different approaches to. And when we actually did look at their data, we actually found that these disaster donors did behave differently. They were generally giving in the wake of some kind of event or disaster. They would often convert to annual giving after the fact. But then when we looked at these regular donors, they actually were not really responding in the wake of a different event or disaster. They were kind of a separate category. And so it's important that organizations can really distinguish these different groups, come up with definitions, and then communicate between teams to make sure that you're not bombarding different groups of donors, with outreach that maybe won't be as effective for them when maybe they're sort of more of a disaster donor and they fall into that category and those behaviors. And then ultimately what comes out of this kind of quick analysis is that you want to then have some documentation across teams so that it's very clear kind of what your process was, how it could be repeated for another research question. And that allows you to have really valuable insights from your first party data. Of course, one of the limitations of first party data is that data can be very siloed. Currently, there are a lot of different softwares, a lot of different tools available for generating insights. And so, you want to be able to unify across these different pieces. You want to unify across Salesforce, every action, all of these different pieces of software that your team might be using across different teams to really have that communication and that 360 view of your donors. And so one first step in this process is thinking about standardizing and documenting your data sets. This is really important because it increases collaboration across your team and really within your team too as well, so that everybody is on the same page about these definitions, about how data should be used. It's also really important where you can to resolve and unify your data sets. If you have different channels of information coming in, for example, you really want to make sure that you can unify that to have that full view of your donors and their journey within your organization. And ultimately, this will help optimize your fundraising process. I'm going to give an example now of one case where we're working with an international federated nonprofit, and they really wanted to unify their data in order to better understand their donors because they had a lot of different offices across countries. It was really important to them to standardize their process. And ultimately, what we came up with a standardized data mapping for all of their different sources. And these were coming in from different source systems. But ultimately, this allowed them to then compare across offices, to compare across channels, and really have a better view, for example, in this retention dashboard, to really have a better view of what was happening across their different offices. Now I'm going to get into a second area of data, which is survey research. And so survey research can be really important. And, I'm sure you've heard of the census. That's a big one for demographic and sociographic information. There's also a lot of other publicly available resources for this kind of research. Our own Civis COVID Impact Research Center, available on our website, is looking into the pandemic and asking public opinion about that. Pew has a lot of good information about different topics. New York Times, Upshot, NPR. There are a lot of good resources out there. And ultimately, this can be really, really helpful, and it's already available to you. And so when we're thinking about the pros and cons of whether you might want to use this publicly available polling as opposed to fielding your own surveys, I think public polling, there are definitely some strengths. It's free, it's already available. These are trusted sources. They have experience in fielding polls, or they have established relationships with pollsters, so you can really trust what they're doing. And if you were to use public polling, it's important to really think about a couple things. First, you want to evaluate how the fielding was conducted, who the respondents were, when it was conducted, because that can be very important for timely topics. How many respondents there were, how the poll was administered, whether an online panel, over the phone. And you want to look at the clarity and specificity of the questionnaire that was delivered to respondents, because that can really impact answers. And finally, it's always important that with these public polls, if you have more questions, you should definitely contact the source, because they can answer your questions. They might even have some additional unpublished data that might be useful for you. But ultimately, custom polling can sometimes be a better answer for your needs, because while it can be a little costly and it can be time intensive, ultimately existing polling isn't always up to date. It may not address the desired audience or the desired topic that you're trying to ask about, because you have to be very specific in survey research. And so what we would recommend for custom polling is you want to work with a pollster or a vendor who has these best practices in mind, and whether that is in the design of the questionnaire itself to minimize bias and to minimize leading respondents, or in how they collect these responses, how they're weighted to be representative of the population you're interested in. There's a lot that these pollsters have in mind. And one example of some survey research that might be of interest is, like I mentioned, Civis runs a COVID-19 impact tracker of funding from the Gates Foundation. And so what we're doing is asking about different social, economic, and educational outcomes during the pandemic in the US. And we're looking at a national level, as well as doing some deep dives for specific states of interest. And that really allows us to, through this custom research, we're really getting at the questions of interest. We're making sure that every subgroup and every population is represented to make this survey research really impactful. Another type of survey that can be really useful for donor management is message testing. And so message testing here, this example is supposed to be kind of at its simplest. You can sort of conduct your own A/B tests, and that might be in the pictured example, that might be two emails that are very similar in the wording, slightly different in the wording, have the same graphic, have a different graphic, but you're kind of doing that head-to-head A/B test. And that's something you can test yourself, whether it's an email, it's a Facebook ad campaign. You just kind of want to have those two randomly selected groups so that you can do a comparison yourself and see which message seems to be more effective. But generally, there are a lot of, as with everything here, there are a lot of best practices you really want to keep in mind, which is why it's very important to know a lot about the methodology behind these data-driven tools. But here, a couple things that we would recommend keeping in mind are knowing your key metrics up front, and that might be what exactly you're measuring with your outcome variables, thinking about how many people and how many respondents and what population you include, how many treatments you want to compare. And within those treatments as well, it's really important to think about in designing them, first, that you're only changing one aspect so that you have a very clear idea of what these differences that you're seeing are actually measuring, and you're not changing maybe 10 different aspects of an image or of an ad. You want to really have that isolated change. You also want to make sure that your options are different enough that they'll stand out, and that the differences you may see in responses are not going to be sort of the product of random error. And you also want to make sure, if you can, to kind of think about treatment design that may be applicable beyond your current test, whether it's sort of thinking about like the tone of your message, the sort of sentiment that the images are conveying, that sort of thing. And then finally, the most important thing, and definitely in our minds, is the experimental design. And so you want to make sure a randomized control trial is sort of the best practice here. And you want to make sure you're randomly assigning these respondents to each treatment and to a control group so that you're able to actually draw reasonable insights. And ultimately, within that way, you're making sure that your groups of interest, whether that's different racial and demographic subgroups, whether that's different political groups, you want to make sure that they're proportionally represented using this randomized format. And so one example of a message test was a message test we conducted for the state of Illinois around a mask wearing public awareness campaign. And this actually found, perhaps not intuitively to everyone, that the most effective message for this campaign was comparing mask wearing to wearing a helmet and a seatbelt. And this actually moved individuals' likelihoods of wearing a mask by 3 percentage points on average, which is a pretty big change. And so it's really important to really have this measurable impact through message testing that you can really use to bolster your advocacy. And finally, the third area we'll be looking at is third-party data and modeling. So third-party data is a really good supplement to your own first-party data. It's really just providing additional context and features for individuals. And so, often, an organization may want to use data to really get that granularity. And so we've worked with organizations who will use our Civis data, for example, to get that individual level data that can really add features and really flesh out their picture of their donors. And this really will allow you to increase the precision of your outreach and your campaigns, because you're just aggregating more information. And that information, maybe it's demographic, maybe it's psychographic, maybe it's behavioral data, but this will really flesh out the picture of your donors. And so one example is geographic data, and this is very free and widely available. Like we mentioned, the census, there's also a lot of cities that now have open data portals that will make this available to you. And this will usually be aggregated at maybe the zip or the county level, but this really is an important feature for kind of getting a better picture of your donors, whether it's county level financial information, educational information. This flesh out your data, and most importantly, third-party data is really important for modeling. And so oftentimes for a nonprofit's use cases, you might be using a model to predict the likelihood of some unknown factor about your donors or your target audience. And so a frequent use of modeling is for sustainer models, where you're looking at the probability that a one-off donor could become a sustainer. You might also be thinking about how to design a model for retention. There are a lot of different things that modeling can be applied to. There's also lookalike models, which can be important if you're trying to identify new audiences that look like your existing pool of donors. But ultimately, a well-trained model is really important for the accuracy of your targeting for fundraising, for really growing the donation of individuals that you're currently engaging with or that you're hoping to engage with, and ultimately giving your donors a better experience because your outreach to them is targeted to their interests and to their likelihood of donating and to their behavioral traits. And so this third-party data is important to models because it provides the additional features that a model can pick up on. And so this is something that may be a little bit trickier to get started on compared to the other tools, just because you do sort of need an understanding of software encoding to some extent. But there are a lot of free open source data science tools for individuals who are interested in learning about modeling. So this one is definitely accessible as well with the right amount of training. And so one example of a model that we built for a large performing arts venue is they were interested in kind of growing their audience and growing their subscribers. And so we built a model so that they could find the top targets for them to make sure that they were getting their outreach to the right people who were most likely to subscribe. And this allows you, to not waste your effort in pouring outreach to people who you think might be interested, but you're not really sure. Modeling will allow you to be a lot more confident in the likelihood that these individuals be interested. And so we're just going to do a little recap of how to become data-driven. So like we talked about, this first-party data is data you already have. It's really important to try to break down silos to make sure that this data is as useful as possible, but already have insights that can be revealed from your own data. Survey research is also really important, and this can break down into polling, into message testing. There is a law already out there for polling, for message testing. This is something you can kind of try to do on your own. But ultimately, if you want something custom, there are a lot of vendors out there who have a lot of experience that they can impart and run these surveys for you. And then third-party data and modeling. And third-party data, again, it'll really supplement that first-party data and build that deeper understanding, whether that's through a model or just through this additional information. And I just want to end with an example, which is sort of what that workflow could look like. And I don't want this to be too intimidating. There are a lot of boxes here, but basically the idea is that being data-driven is an entire process. It's a sort of a culture change and involves a lot of new, the incorporation of new tools, of new best practices, of really uniting your team around whatever your research question is at the moment, whatever, standards and documentation you have. But ultimately you'll have this great workflow out of it, and it will simplify your donor management to a more data-driven and more actionable approach. To that flow chart, I don't want anyone to be a little intimidated. There are some starting points that are a little bit simpler than that. So first, you just really want to start with that clear, self-contained research question, and that can just be, of any scope that you want, but it's good to make sure it's very clear and actionable so that it's tied to a decision your team will be making and that all your stakeholders are bought into. Because we want to do this research. We want to have this data-driven approach with actual data-driven results. And then finally, we have linked to Civis resources on getting started with a sort of data-driven approach. So I hope this was really helpful. We'd love to go into questions.
Lizzy, thank you. That was helpful. You walked through, I think, some really key points. And we do have questions in the chat, which is fantastic. And one question is, can you explain psychographic data and the best way to use it?
I don't want to claim any expertise here. I think that with all of these different sort of areas of data, generally it's not so much that you'll say like, oh, I'm adding on this additional to something that I'm then going to look at. It's more that you kind of want to be able to aggregate as many features as possible. And so whether that is kind of, whether that's the geographic data, whether that's demographic data, at the end of the day, they're all additional features that you can either incorporate into a model or that you can kind of use analyze to see which of these seems to be, aligned with the differences in behavior we're seeing. You're kind of looking for these correlations in, what feature seems to be tied. Like, is it income? Is it zip code? Like, what do these seem to be kind of in concert with the differences in behavior we're seeing?
Mm-hmm. So another way to put that, perhaps, is really thinking about what's the total view of the intended donor that the organization wants to see, and then building that in.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Another question, we'll think about how we can answer this one. How would someone learn how to use modeling languages? This may be a little tricky because there are so many tools and resources out there. But as someone that works in data quite a bit, what are your suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, I think this really depends on your interest level and bandwidth, because definitely a lot of people in the data science field are self-taught, but it does require a bit of a commitment because an entire language, like all of these open source data tools are very available and have a lot of documentation, but you'll need to know how to code, in R, Python. There'll be some kind of language you'll probably have to learn first. But with that time investment comes a whole new world of tools you can use. Because if you're learning how to model at the same time, you're also learning the skills of how to, create visualizations. You're learning how to clean data. It's sort of an investment that if your team is willing to make it can make a big difference. But I'm not going to say that it's not a large time investment.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to some of the points that were made earlier today about how to create the culture around data. And if someone is really passionate about that and is willing to take that on as a learning opportunity for themselves, then they'll be better able and equipped to have those conversations internally and show the results that can impact business decisions. So to your point, it takes time, but nonetheless seems like it can be certainly fruitful for folks that are willing to invest in that. Actually, we do have a couple minutes. Another question just came in from Janelle. So thank you, Janelle. What's the best way to truly randomize audiences for A/B testing?
I think this will definitely depend on the tool you're using. I mean, ideally, you really just want it to be completely random. And there are a lot of random number generator tools out there. If you do have a list, you're able to actually feed in and randomize. But that said, it does depend. If you're working with a vendor, they can make sure they're doing it for you. If you have a list, you can. I'm sure there's tools in Excel as well. Like, there are a lot of different ways you can make sure you have a completely randomized audience, but you just really want to make sure you have that element in there so that solid experimental design to build off of, and you're not incorporating any biases in the kind of traits of the different respondents you're testing on.
Yeah, and I think a corollary to that is, how do you determine the best features to test? And as you were pointing out in your presentation, it's key to really isolate the different components. And so there aren't 10 things that are being tested at once, because then there's no true way to understand what is having an impact. And so I think that's where some of the consultation with an expert is really helpful too.
Yes, definitely. And I think, it's a little simpler maybe if you're testing kind of like the text of an email versus an image versus like a video ad. Of course, there are going to be increasingly more features that you can kind of filter and test against each other. But definitely, I think like Patrice said, you really want to ideally work with someone who has a little bit of experience in the field to help you kind of direct that effort towards the features that might be the most salient.
Awesome. Well, Lizzy, thank you. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and certainly thank all of the folks that asked questions. And please feel free to follow up with any additional questions you may have. We're happy to answer those. Lizzy, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Our next session will start in a few moments, and that will be communicating with donors. So now that you know how to manage your donors, let's think about how we can better communicate with them. That session will be coming up in a few moments. Thank you.